Hey class, this is Mr. Schmidt with the Environmental Science Recap for November 19th. Okay, I already did a little recap for the lab. Now we're talking about biodiversity and ecosystems. Okay, so remember we had an earlier assignment where I asked you what you wanted to be famous for. I had some great answers. Just to let you know the range of my question, if anything, if you wanted to be famous for 15 minutes, what would you want to be famous for? One person said they'd never want to be famous, and the other person said they'd use their 15 minutes of fame to build more fame. Okay, so all sorts of different answers within that range. Please make sure your assignment comes in because those have been wonderful to read. Okay, now today we're talking about biodiversity and ecosystems, and we're trying to describe the levels of biodiversity. Okay, so an ecosystem, let's start off with the fact that an ecosystem, this is the larger area where the climate is the same, but all the species, all the plants and animals are constantly in flux as the environment changes. Okay, so as we look at that, we can look at the keystone species. So when they say keystone, they're talking about an engineering term. So when you were building a bridge or building an arch, you start putting stones on top of each other and you start building the arch, and that last stone in the very center is the keystone, where if you remove it, it all collapses in. And this is the keystone species, whereas you put all the plants and animals within the ecosystem together, there's going to be one plant or animal that's going to hold it all together. And if you remove that one species, it all collapses in. Okay, for kelp forests, that happens to be sea otters. Okay, this is the species that's critical to the functioning of the ecosystem. So sea otters do a couple things. Most importantly, they eat sea urchins and crabs. Sea urchins eat kelp, and the fish depend on the kelp for food and shelter. So if you take away the sea otters, then you have sea urchins can eat as much kelp as they want, and soon all the kelp disappears and the fish no longer have any food or shelter. So let's reverse this. What would happen if you kept the sea otters, but one species of fish left? Well, you'd still have sea otters, you'd still have sea urchins, you'd still have kelp, you'd still have other species of fish, you'd just be down one. So it may be a little more fragile of an environment, but it is still a healthy ecosystem, even if one species of fish disappears. Okay, sea otters, by the way, also eat crabs, which I looked at the Monterey Bay Aquarium website, which is a fantastic aquarium, and I hope to go there someday, and has a great website as well. They talk about how sea otters also eat crabs, and the crabs do a lot of burrowing and change the soil or the surface environment for the plants. And if there's too many crabs, then the surface of the dirt contacting the ocean changes and the plants can't grow. So too many crabs, not enough plants. You limit the number of crabs, you increase the number of plants, and you have more fish. Okay, so that's another way that the sea otters help maintain this stable environment. Okay, so let's look at a second keystone species, and that is the jaguars found in South America. Okay, in the jungles there. Okay, so this, again, this keystone species has a greater impact on other populations. Okay, the jaguars are opportunistic hunters, meaning they will hunt and eat any animal they can find, whether it's small rabbit and rodent type animals that they find in the jungle, or it's alligator and big reptiles type animals, or deer and those types of animals. They will eat or have been found to eat 87 different kinds of species. So remember, we talked about the otters eating sea urchins and crabs. And if they don't do that, the plants get destroyed by the intermediate tertiary zone. Okay, same thing here. If the jaguars stop eating all the herbivores, then the deer and the other herbivores will eat all of the plants, and all the plants will disappear, and then we get a crashed ecosystem. So as long as the jaguars keep the other animals in check, then the plants can continue to grow. There will still be animals to eat the plants, and we can keep a nice, stable ecosystem throughout this entire process. Okay, so when we talk diversity within environmental science, we're talking about three different things. Number one, we are talking about species diversity. Okay, so species diversity is the number of different species in an area. Okay, so here we see, we count these up and count up how many different kinds of trees we have, species diversity. Okay, so remember, we had the jaguars in South America. The Brazilian rainforest, the Amazon rainforest, is one of the most diverse ecosystems in the world. Okay, say maybe competing with that could be like the Great Barrier Reef off of Australia in terms of how many different species are present. Okay, so if we have something like the Amazon rainforest here, that's going to be a huge number. And then we're going to see at the end of our lecture, some things come down to nearly one species for diversity, right? So that's one type of measure, species diversity. The next one is ecosystem diversity. So remember, the ecosystem is the variety of habitats and communities and ecological processes within the ecosystem. Okay, so here we have streams and bogs and swamps and fields and trees and small trees and shrubs and all these different types of habitat for different animals and plants to grow and thrive. Okay, if we came in and leveled all the ground and drained all the bogs and all the wetlands and made it nice and level and even, and removed all the different species diversity as well, then we'll lose different ecosystems and different habitats. Okay, so that is the two extremes here as well. Okay, so I would consider the rainforests around Olympic Peninsula would be a very diverse ecosystem. Okay, we can go up a mountain, we can go down into the ocean, we can have all sorts of streams and waterfalls and wetlands, and there can be a great diversity of ecosystems and of habitats within this area. Okay, and then the third thing we can do is we can zoom into one specific population and look at the diversity of the genes. Okay, a gene is a piece of DNA code for a specific trait that has been inherited by an organism's offsprings. So when we have something like a cheetah here, okay, cheetahs make, well, baby cheetah cubs come along, they're going to have the combination of DNA from their two parents. And cheetahs all are the same size and the same color and have the same similar patterns of spots and eat the same types of foods and have the same temperatures and are exposed to this, or survive at the same kinds of environmental conditions. So there's very little genetic diversity within these large cats, within these specific cheetahs. Okay, so they have very low genetic diversity, but when we look here at a study they did of genetic diversity of different species, what they found is domestic cats are the exact opposite of cheetahs. Okay, we had 4 examples in our class of you guys talking about your different cats. They were all different colors, they had different sizes. Their hairs seem to be about the same. It'd be interesting to see the pictures of the cats to see if the hair length was all the same. And that diversity within cats means if there was a disease that hit cats, Some of them would get very sick and die, but other ones would survive and be able to carry on within the ecosystem. Okay, the thought is cheetahs, if a disease hit cheetahs, it could easily wipe out the entire species because they have so little diversity. Okay, so if it became super cold or super hot for a year here, there'll be some cats that are well adapted to whatever environment we put them in. But if the temperature of the savanna or wherever the cheetahs are living, that changes dramatically for a year or two, none of the cheetahs will survive. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. But notice the numbers on this graph. We're talking percentages of 0.002, 0.001, okay, and this is 0.0005. That's the percent change of DNA. So even the most diverse species have over 99% of their DNA in common with the rest of their species. Okay, and here we see humans actually have even more in common with the rest of humanity than some of these other animals. Like giant pandas, I found super surprising because it's such a small population, but apparently a very large genetic diversity even within that population. So when it came time to do this measuring, the way they came up with these numbers is they pulled the genes, the DNA, and they mapped them and they compared them to other ones. So this is obviously not a 0.002 match, but this is an example of what an extreme difference would look like on one site, one allele. Okay, is that one could have almost all the red genes and one could have almost all of the green genes, causing different types of domestic cats. Okay, and then you could have some that are mixed within that. But remember, we're still only talking 0.002 as the total difference. So they've cleaned up this data quite a bit here. Okay, so remember we talked about the Amazon rainforest as having the most diversity, okay, and places like the Olympic National Forest having a diversity within the different habitats. Well, the extreme example opposite of those two would be monoculture. If you took land in eastern Oregon or eastern Washington and you flattened it all out and you planted all of one crop and all of one species and all of one variety, you'll get very good farming yields because it'll all bloom at the same time. It'll all produce crops at the same time. You can get out all of your infrastructure at the same time and make a decent amount of money. But what they found out 100 years ago is if the weather changes or if a different insect comes in, it can wipe out the entire crop all at once. Okay, so that's why we get things like the Dust Bowl. That's how we get things like the Irish potato famine. Okay, if it's all one single crop, then it can't withstand much change. It is not a very stable ecosystem. Okay, so these monocultures, these one types of plants lack diversity, lack biodiversity, which hinders natural pest control. Okay, so if grasshoppers come and start eating all the plants, if they like corn, they're just going to keep eating corn and reproducing and making more and more of the same species and completely decimating that one crop. Okay, so that unwanted species, the grasshopper in this example, can spread throughout the entire fields with ease due to an abundance of their host species, the corn, and the lack of natural predators. Okay, so if you had a lot of trees there, a lot of places for birds to live, and the birds can eat the grasshoppers, then you could cut this down. Then you could stop the infestation of grasshoppers. But if you took out all the trees and you have only corn, yeah, you lack those natural predators. And by the way, this is from a University of Massachusetts study. Okay, and then you could also plant different things. Rather than just having corn, you could have soybeans and kidney beans and wheat and sunflowers, and you could start diversifying your fields and leaving some trees and tree stands around. Okay, so these diverse fields, the pests are going to encounter more resistance when attempting to invade, and those natural predators will exist. That's known as biological controls, where it'll limit the movement. Okay, and like I said, things like the potato famine are classic examples of not just insects coming in, but different molds can also move in and move quickly, and they are very hard to stop. Okay. All right. So here we see an example of some of the data and some of the concerns here. So if we look at from 2020 to the 2050, how many different species are present at one point versus another? So right now we're kind of in a low point where we have much less species diversity within Europe. And the hope is that they can start bringing back some of that diversity and some of that biological stability that diversity brings. Okay. So those are kind of small scale examples if you're looking at one field or even one continent. Okay. But if we're looking at the whole world over long periods of time, hundreds of millions of years, we see that there's been 5 big extinction events. Okay. So those 5 are in this drawing here from Washington Post, that we have life beginning about 600 million years ago, and then it kept increasing with the troglobites and the Cambrian fauna, those plants. Okay, and then something happened, the genetic diversity dipped. Okay, keeps kind of going up and down. Okay, we have some big hits. Okay, notice at the end of Cretaceous, that's like when maybe a meteor or something hit, and the reptiles and the dinosaurs ended, and the mammals came and increased their diversity. Okay, so those are the 5. So the 6th one is that this recent estimate suggests that extinction threatens up to 1 million species of plants and animals. Okay, so that is currently, and a large part of this species extinction is in part because of human activities such as deforestation, hunting, and overfishing. Okay, so remember, if we hunt and fish and remove those keystone species, there'll be all sorts of other species that are also affected. Or if we remove the habitat and we get rid of that habitat diversity, that can also have the same effects. Okay, so finally, if we look at a little bit shorter time, just like 100 million years, we see that as humans came on the scene in Africa, then the large mammals slowly declined. Okay, but they seem to evolve with humans, which shows that they've had more success. Okay, but as humans moved from continent to continent and island to island, we see that as they arrive, they've had a huge negative effect on the percent of large mammal species. Okay, all right, so that takes us through our talk here of the different levels of biodiversity and the ways we measure biodiversity. So with that, you can complete what should be a very short assignment reflecting on our notes, and turn that in next week. All right, and with that, I hope you all have a good afternoon, and I will see you later.